They were bought. They were caged. They were displayed like animals. Not in the ancient world, not in some lost empire, but in modern cities, in New York, in London, in Paris. At the height of the 19th and early 20th century, thousands of men, women, and children were kidnapped, tricked, or sold into an industry that called itself entertainment, but functioned as a public display of racial superiority, a human zoo. They were labeled savages, primitives, curiosities, but they were real people, with names, with families, with souls. And we caged them for crowds, for profit, for science. This was the age of display, an era that would see European and American powers transform living, breathing human beings into exhibits. The justification? They weren't civilized. The purpose? To prove white supremacy through spectacle. Human zoos weren't sideshows. They were central attractions at world's fairs. They were endorsed by museums, universities, royal families. In 1889, the Paris Exposition drew 28 million visitors. Many came not for the machines or monuments, but to see the 400 indigenous people brought from colonies, living in constructed villages, surrounded by guards, and watched like animals. In the United States, city zoos became more than just collections of animals. In 1906, the Bronx Zoo, one of the most respected in the country, placed a Congolese man inside a monkey enclosure. His name was Ota Benga, and he will come to define the tragedy we're about to uncover. But this didn't start with Ota. This began decades earlier, when European empires were reaching the height of their colonial powers, and they needed a way to justify their cruelty to the public. They needed to show the British and American middle class that they weren't enslaving or colonizing equals, but inferiors. And so they displayed them. Dark-skinned, bare-chested, decorated in beads or war paint, sometimes forced, sometimes fabricated. To the average citizen, these exhibits were exotic and thrilling. To the organizers, they were tools. To the world, they became symbols of a brutal, racist pseudoscience dressed up as anthropology. Some were brought from Africa, others from the Philippines, South America, Australia. Many never returned. This is not a story about entertainment. This is a story about dehumanization, about how entire nations watched, applauded, even paid for the chance to stare at another human being like a creature from a jungle. And the worst part, they called it education. In the early 1900s, a man named Samuel Phillips Werner, a former Presbyterian missionary turned explorer, arrived in Africa on a mission. His task? To collect people. That word wasn't metaphor. He was hired to bring back indigenous Africans to be displayed at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Werner found Ota Benga, whose wife and children had just been slaughtered in a tribal conflict with the Force Publique, Belgium's violent colonial military. Vulnerable, alone, grieving. Ota Benga was convinced to travel with Werner. What he didn't know was that he was about to become a spectacle. The St. Louis World's Fair was one of the grandest public events of the century. Over 19 million people attended. Among the exhibits, reconstructed villages filled with tribal peoples performing daily rituals while fairgoers gawked, laughed, and threw food. Ota Benga became a crowd favorite, not for anything he said or did, but because of his size. He was only 4 feet 11 inches tall, slim, agile, and quick. The public called him a pygmy, a miniature savage, a living link to some imagined past. But it didn't end there. After the fair, Ota Benga was supposed to return home. But Werner had other plans. In 1906, he took Ota Benga to New York City, where he was placed, without his consent, in the Bronx Zoo. Not as a worker, as an exhibit. The Bronx Zoo was managed by the New York Zoological Society, whose founding members included well-known scientists and naturalists. In their view, humans were part of the evolutionary chain, and displaying a so-called primitive man in proximity to apes would be educational. So they did it. Ota Benga was put in the monkey house next to an orangutan named Dohong. They made him hold a spear. They gave him bones to chew. They posted signs that read, "African pygmy age 23, height 4 feet 11 inches, weight 103 pounds, brought from the Congo by Dr. Samuel P. Werner." Over 40,000 people came to see him on the first weekend alone. They laughed. They pointed. Some poked at the bars of the cage. Others threw peanuts. Ota Benga became the most popular attraction in the zoo. They called it ethnographic education. They called it cultural exchange. But it was entertainment at the expense of dignity. And Britain, the empire that once ruled a quarter of the globe, was no innocent bystander in the human zoo phenomenon. In fact, it was one of its most polished, public, and profitable architects. By the mid-1800s, as Queen Victoria's empire stretched across continents, the British public grew obsessed with its colonial subjects. Not for their politics, not for their literature, but for their appearances, their customs, their primitive ways of life. And what better way to show the strength of the empire than by parading its conquests? One of the most infamous figures in this spectacle was a man named Karl Hagenbeck, a German merchant who made his fortune capturing animals for zoos. But animals weren't enough. By the 1870s, he began transporting people. Indigenous people from Africa, the Arctic, the Pacific Islands, displayed in makeshift villages across Europe. His exhibitions came to London, where they caused a media frenzy. Crowds flooded to see Nubians, Samoans, and Inuit families in artificial tribal settings told to dance, eat, and fight for the amusement of onlookers. But it wasn't just Karl Hagenbeck. In 1886, the Colonial and Indian exhibition was opened by Queen Victoria herself. It was designed to celebrate the glory of the British Empire. But what was its centerpiece? Living people, transported from the colonies. 34 Indian artisans, hand-picked to demonstrate their craft in recreated Indian workshops. They worked under surveillance. They were observed like museum objects. Newspapers praised their docility. The public marveled at their clothing, skin, and accents. But no one asked what they had left behind. No one asked if they came willingly. In Liverpool, the city that had once been a hub for the transatlantic slave trade, these human displays continued well into the 20th century. In 1948, as late as post-World War II, Somali men were showcased at a city zoo event, dressed in traditional garments and asked to perform rituals for the audience. Not as cultural ambassadors, as curiosities. And in schools across Britain, children were taken on field trips not just to view lions or giraffes, but to witness the natives of the empire firsthand. It was framed as education, but it was indoctrination. A subtle message to a generation: these people are not like you. These people are yours to rule. These people are lesser. Even more shocking? The role of science in this theater. British anthropologists armed with calipers and cameras, measured the skulls and bodies of the displayed subjects. They logged their features. They photographed their naked forms, all in the name of racial hierarchy to prove that white Europeans were more evolved, more advanced, more worthy. Human exhibitions became data collection sites, and these photos and notes were sent back to institutions like the British Museum, where they were used to support the now debunked pseudoscience of social Darwinism. This wasn't a freak show on the fringes of society. It was mainstream culture, endorsed by royalty, academia, and the press. And it left scars. For many of those brought to Britain, their experience was alienating, humiliating, and in some cases, permanent. Some died in Britain, buried far from home, with no names on their graves. The British Empire didn't just extract gold, spices, and labor. It extracted dignity, and it turned people into living artifacts. What would make a man place another man in a cage? What would make an entire nation applaud it? The answer isn't just ignorance. It's something far more dangerous. Science weaponized by ideology. In the 19th and early 20th century, Western science wasn't always about discovery. Often, it was about control, about ranking humanity. And the human zoo was one of its most sinister tools. It all began with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, a powerful idea, but one easily twisted. While Darwin himself never advocated for racism, his work was hijacked by others to construct social Darwinism, the belief that human societies, like animals, evolved through struggle, and that some races are naturally superior to others. This pseudoscience became the perfect justification for empire. Enter the anthropologists, the craniologists, the museum men. Armed with rulers, calipers, and cameras, they descended on the human exhibits. They measured skulls, recorded jaw lines, photographed posture, skin tone, nose width, foot size. They believed they could quantify civilization. They believed the size of a skull could define a man's intelligence. They believed melanin meant inferiority. And with every number they wrote down, they reinforced a brutal myth: that white Europeans were the pinnacle of evolution. Everyone else? A step above the apes. One of the most infamous examples came from the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, where over 1,100 indigenous Filipinos were placed on display in what was called the Philippine Exposition. They were organized by tribe. The Igorot people, known for hunting dogs for food, were exaggerated and exploited. Fair organizers made them kill and eat dogs on a schedule not for their culture, but for spectacle. Scientists watched closely. Journalists wrote feverishly. Visitors joked about savagery while sipping lemonade. The exhibition was promoted as proof that America needed to civilize the Philippines after taking the colony in the Spanish-American War. It was colonization, masked as charity. And science played along. In Britain, science cloaked its racism in academic robes. See note, anthropological societies held public lectures describing Africans and Asians as less evolved. Museums showcased skulls of colonized peoples like trophies. And London's respected scientific institutions collaborated with showmen like Carl Hagenbeck, providing credibility to the human zoo industry. To the public, it all felt justified. The men in white coats had spoken. It was data. It was research. It was a lie. The human zoos weren't just about spectacle. They were propaganda machines broadcasting a vision of the world where white supremacy was not opinion, but fact. And this thinking infected everything. It shaped immigration policy. It influenced education systems. It carved a racial hierarchy into the very foundation of modern Western society. The people inside the cages, they were the evidence. Their pain was turned into proof. But behind every measurement was a man, a woman, a child. And when the crowds went home, when the lights dimmed, they were left to carry the weight of a world that reduced them to objects. The crowds disappeared. The cages were dismantled. But the people never truly left. Because of the trauma stayed behind. After the curtains fell on the human zoo era, the West quietly tucked this chapter away. No apologies, no reparations, just silence. The names of the people exhibited vanished from public memory. Ota Benga, who died by his own hand. The Congolese children displayed in London, who were never recorded. The Igorot tribesmen forced into rituals at gunpoint. The Aboriginal men and women sent from Australia to Europe, never to return. They became ghosts of history. For decades, the narrative was rewritten. The exhibitions were rebranded as cultural showcases, educational, harmless, even celebrations of diversity. Photographs remained in archives. Posters gathered dust in museum basements. But the stories, they were left untold. In schools across the UK and US, students learned about Darwin, Victoria, Roosevelt, and the world's fairs. But never about the children displayed in cages beside orangutans. Never about the scientists who poked and measured black and indigenous bodies like furniture. Never about the wounds still felt by their descendants. Yet, memory has a way of resurfacing. In recent decades, researchers, activists, and artists have begun the work of excavation, pulling truth from the silence. In 2012, Belgium, one of the worst offenders in the human zoo phenomenon, finally apologized for a 1958 exhibition in Brussels that featured Congolese men and women behind barriers, surrounded by exotic props. In 2020, France held public discussions about its colonial legacy, including its long history of indigenous display. In the US, the Bronx Zoo formally acknowledged and condemned the exhibition of Ota Benga over a century after his death. And in the UK, conversations about decolonizing museums, education, and public memory are growing louder. But apology is only the beginning, because the scars remain. The psychological damage inflicted on entire communities, the legacy of racial hierarchy embedded in Western institutions, the invisibility of the people who were never meant to be remembered as human. And yet, here they are. Remembered now. Named now. Finally pulled from the footnotes of history into the light. The story of human zoos is not just a story of cruelty. It's a story of what happens when science, power, and entertainment unite without conscience. It's a warning. And it's a responsibility. We owe it to those who were caged. To tell the truth. To speak their names. To say, at long last, you were never a display. You were never a savage. You were human. And we see you. For decades, the story of the human zoo was buried. History textbooks omitted it. Museums glossed over it. And the descendants of those exhibited were left to live with a silence too heavy for words. But silence does not mean peace. And forgetting does not mean healing. Across the UK, the US, and Europe, a new reckoning is rising, one led not by institutions, but by voices long suppressed. In Belgium, protests outside the Royal Museum for Central Africa forced the institution to confront its colonial displays. For decades, it showed statues of African people as submissive, childlike, or primitive. Today, it includes interactive exhibits detailing Belgium's brutal colonization of the Congo. The change wasn't voluntary, it was demanded. In France, artist activists staged reenactments of human zoos on the streets of Paris, not to repeat history, but to shock the public into remembering it. In the UK, the conversation about decolonizing museums and curriculums has intensified. Institutions like the British Museum are under pressure to return stolen artifacts and publicly acknowledge their role in dehumanizing colonized peoples. And in the United States, descendants of victims like Ota Benga are telling their own stories. In 2017, a book titled Ota Benga, The Pygmy in the Zoo, reopened old wounds and gave his story the dignity it was always denied. Soon after, the Bronx Zoo issued a formal statement of regret. But these efforts are only the beginning. Because what was taken wasn't just freedom, it was identity, dignity, memory. For many communities, the trauma of being displayed like an object still lingers in generations. Some families never saw their loved ones return. Others were never told what happened to them. And even today, the remnants of these zoos exist in archives, in photo collections, in university basements, where skulls are still catalogued like curiosities. Yet, people are fighting back. Through documentaries, public memorials, protest art, grassroots education, and legal demands for repatriation, they are uncaging the truth. But perhaps the most powerful form of resistance is remembering. Because history forgotten is history repeated. The story of human zoos is not ancient. It is not over. It is a mirror reflecting the ways we still exoticize, dehumanize, and divide. The question is, now that we've uncovered it, what will we do with it? Will we teach it? Will we change because of it? Will we finally see those who were once caged not as exhibits of shame, but as symbols of resistance and survival? Because they were never less than human. But we, the spectators, so often were. This is not just history. It's a lesson. And it's one we can't afford to ignore.